I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of being alone in the woods, away from anyone, felt like the perfect escape from the endless noise of the city, from the constant hum of people, cars, and work. The cabin I found was remote, nearly a mile from the nearest road, perched on the edge of a dense forest. It was small and old, wooden, with a steep roof and a single chimney, the kind that seemed inviting at first glance but also had a sense of isolation, the kind that made the mind start filling in its own stories. The forest around it was thick, tall pines and oaks with dense undergrowth, so dense that the sunlight only reached the floor in patches. The drive up was long. Gravel roads, potholes, and the occasional deer crossing kept me alert. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, the forest turning orange and gold with the late afternoon light. I parked the car, unloaded my bag, and looked at the cabin. It was silent, too silent. No birds singing, no wind rustling the trees, just stillness. I shrugged it off as the normal hush of the late afternoon forest and carried my bag inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. Cobwebs hung in corners, and there were scratches on the wooden floor that looked like animals had been inside before. The furniture was simple. A wooden table, a couple of chairs, a small bed in the corner, and a stove. I unpacked slowly, trying to make the space feel like mine for the next few days. I stacked firewood near the stove and checked the windows. They were thick, old glass, and most had locks, though the locks looked fragile. Outside, the forest seemed to press against the cabin, darkening as the sun sank lower. Night came fast. I lit a fire in the stove, the crackling filling the quiet cabin. Shadows danced on the walls, long and twisting with the flicker of flames. I made a simple dinner, canned beans heated in a small pot, and tried to ignore the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The forest was alive, I told myself. Animals, maybe a fox, a raccoon, nothing more. I forced myself to focus on the warmth of the fire and the smell of burning wood. The first sound came late in the night, a thump, soft but deliberate, like something heavy brushing against the cabin. I froze. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was just the wind. The trees were close, branches brushing the cabin, leaves rattling. I tried to calm myself and went back to my small cot, pulling a blanket tightly around me. Then, another sound, a scratching, sharper this time, at the side of the cabin. My pulse jumped. It wasn't the wind. Wind doesn't make deep, deliberate scratches. I didn't sleep much. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every creak of the old wood made me tense. The wind howled outside, carrying sounds that could have been branches breaking or paws moving across dry leaves. I told myself to stay calm. I was in a cabin with solid walls. I was safe. Morning didn't bring comfort. The first thing I noticed was the tracks outside. Large, deep paw prints pressed into the mud around the cabin. Too big for a dog, too precise for a bear walking casually. They circled the cabin, coming close to the walls, stopping at the windows, then heading back into the woods. My stomach turned. This wasn't a random animal passing by. This was deliberate. Something was assessing me, sizing me up. I spent the day making the cabin more secure. I reinforced the windows with sticks I could wedge against the frames, checked the locks, and moved the heavier furniture in front of the door. I kept a knife on the table next to the bed and another in my pocket. Every sound outside made me flinch. A snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the brush of something large against the undergrowth. I didn't leave the cabin, not even to get water from the small stream nearby. The tracks showed me that whatever was out there wasn't afraid of humans. The nights were worse. I could hear breathing sometimes, heavy and low, close to the cabin walls. There were moments when I thought I saw movement through the windows, huge shapes moving just beyond the light of the fire. I never saw eyes, never saw teeth, but the shadows alone made my mind race. I started sleeping with my back against the wall, knife in hand, fire close. Days passed, and I began to notice more signs. The firewood I had stacked outside was shifted. My bag had scratches along the side. I started keeping everything inside the cabin, closing the door every time I left. Even small movements outside made me jump. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. Every plan I had made for emergencies was useless. On the third night, I heard it again, closer than ever. The thump of heavy paws on the porch, followed by a scratching at the door. I held my breath, gripping the knife tightly. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear, wolf, something worse. I had heard of wild mountain lions in these areas, large, silent, deadly. Everything I had read about survival in the woods came to mind, but nothing felt sufficient. The animal stayed for hours. I could hear it pacing outside, sniffing, circling, moving. Occasionally, it would tap the window with its paw, and I could feel the vibrations through the floor. I stayed motionless, barely breathing, waiting for some sign that it had gone. Morning came slowly, gray and heavy, and when I finally dared to look outside, the paw prints were all around the cabin, but there was no sign of the animal itself. I knew then that leaving wasn't optional. I had supplies, yes, but I couldn't survive indefinitely while something this large and determined was outside, studying me. I spent the next day preparing. I packed essentials: food, water, fire-starting tools, and my knife. I planned the fastest route back to the road. The forest, I realized, was both cover and danger. Any sudden movement could draw attention. I decided to wait until late afternoon, when shadows were long but daylight still offered visibility. The walk out was tense beyond measure. I kept my eyes on the tracks, constantly scanning the woods. Every crack of a branch made my heart jump. I thought I saw movement in the trees ahead more than once, but it always turned out to be a trick of light and shadow. I moved slowly, deliberately, trying not to make any sudden noises. At one point, a large black shape darted between the trees, and I froze, barely breathing until it vanished. I wasn't running. I knew that sudden movement might provoke it. It took hours to reach the road. By the time I saw my car, I was exhausted, covered in sweat and mud, shaking. I never looked back. I didn't want to see the shape following me. I loaded the car quickly and started the engine, the sound of it loud and comforting after the quiet of the woods. As I drove away, the cabin faded behind me, swallowed by the trees, and the road opened up into the familiar stretches of asphalt. The relief didn't come immediately. Even after hours of driving, I kept glancing at the woods on either side, expecting to see movement. My body was tense, my nerves raw. It took days before I could sleep without imagining heavy paws on the porch. I never returned to that cabin. I told myself it was enough to have survived, to have gotten out. Some experiences, I realized, weren't about adventure. They were about staying alive. The forest remained quiet after that, but I knew it hadn't been quiet because nothing was there. The paw prints, the sounds, the scratches, they were proof. I had encountered a predator, a real one that didn't care about legends or fairy tales. It was patient, it was curious, and it was deadly. I never saw it up close, and I hoped I never would, but I remembered everything. The weight of its presence, the sound of it moving through the forest, and the long, terrible night when the world outside my cabin was alive with something I could neither reason with nor escape completely. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. I had taken a map, printed from an old site, and my GPS kept insisting I was off route, which only made me more anxious as I followed the winding forest roads. It was late afternoon, and the sun was low, cutting long shadows across the trees. Every few minutes, a deer would dart across the road, or the rustle of some unseen animal would echo in the forest. I had decided to go alone to clear my head, to escape the noise of the city, but as the road narrowed and potholes appeared, I started questioning that decision. Eventually, I found the cabin. It was small, rustic, and set far back from the road, almost hidden by tall pine trees. The roof was shingled, a few missing pieces, and the windows were dusty but intact. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped down from the car. I carried all my gear: a backpack, a duffel bag, a cooler with food, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight, though the sun was still out. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood, the kind that sinks into your clothes and hair. The main room had a small wood stove, a table with a few chairs, and shelves lined with mismatched dishes and cans of food. The air was cool, even with the sun streaming in, and it had that damp, closed-in smell that only old buildings in the woods have. I unpacked my gear, stacked firewood next to the stove, and set out to inspect the rest of the cabin. The bedroom was small, with a single bed and a thin mattress. The blanket looked old but usable, and the pillow had flattened over time. There was a window that faced the dense forest behind the cabin. I could hear the wind in the trees, the occasional bird, and something else. An odd, scraping sound, soft but persistent. I dismissed it as a branch brushing against the cabin. I decided to start a fire. The lighter worked on the first strike, and soon the stove was crackling, filling the cabin with warmth and the comforting smell of burning wood. I cooked some simple food, a can of beans and a small pack of rice, and settled into the main room, listening to the forest outside. The light was fading fast. I could see shadows moving across the walls as the sun disappeared, and the forest outside turned into a black silhouette against the dim sky. As darkness fell, I realized how isolated I truly was. There was no cell service, no neighbors, nothing but trees for as far as I could see. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, on the simple task of keeping the cabin tidy, but the feeling of being watched was hard to shake. Every noise, the snap of a branch, a rustle in the underbrush, made me tense. I told myself it was just wildlife, but the sound was too deliberate, too close, as if something was moving around the edge of the clearing. Hours passed. I moved from room to room, checking the doors and windows. Everything was locked. Everything seemed secure, but I kept hearing it, the faint, slow scraping outside. It wasn't constant, but it was there, sometimes just for a few seconds, sometimes longer. I stayed near the stove, keeping the fire alive, listening. The wind made the trees sway, making branches scrape against the cabin, but I couldn't convince myself that was all it was. Later, I went outside to collect more firewood. The moon was high and bright, illuminating the clearing. I carried a small flashlight, scanning the edges of the forest. That's when I saw it. Footprints, not human. They were large, uneven, clawed, pressed into the dirt and soft earth near the tree line. My heart raced. I stepped back quietly, scanning the surrounding trees, trying to hear anything that might indicate movement. But there was nothing, just the wind and the distant calls of night birds. I decided to stay outside a little longer, hoping it was just an animal passing through, maybe a bear or a large deer. But then I noticed something else. The footprints were heading in a circle. They came toward the cabin, then disappeared back into the forest and reappeared, making a loop around the clearing. Whoever or whatever was out there was circling. I returned inside, locking the door and windows, and sat close to the stove. I kept a kitchen knife on the table within reach. Every sound outside made my heart jump. I tried to rationalize. Bears usually avoid humans. Coyotes don't leave tracks like that. Something else, maybe, but I couldn't think clearly. My hands were shaking, my body tense. I kept listening, counting the minutes, waiting for the sound of claws or paws against the wood. Around midnight, I decided to sleep, telling myself I needed rest. I slept lightly, waking at every creak, every whisper of wind. The scraping continued, irregular now, sometimes far, sometimes close. I couldn't tell if it was a single animal or several. Morning light brought some relief, though the forest still looked ominous. I explored the perimeter of the cabin carefully, marking the footprints. They didn't go far into the forest, always staying near the clearing. I realized I had to leave eventually, but the road was long, and I wanted to survive the night first. That day, I tried to keep busy, chopping wood, cleaning the cabin, organizing my gear. The forest seemed quiet, almost unnaturally so. But as night came, the sounds returned, louder this time. Scraping, snapping twigs, something moving close to the cabin walls. I kept the fire burning, and for the first time, I barricaded the doors with furniture. Around 2 a.m., I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, right outside the main window. My stomach sank. This was no deer or coyote. I grabbed the knife and stayed near the window, watching, but the darkness was impenetrable. Then I noticed shadows moving between the trees, large, heavy shapes that ducked and slithered among the trunks. I realized the creature or creatures were deliberately stalking the cabin, watching, waiting. I spent the night crouched behind the stove, clutching the knife, listening to the low, constant movement outside. Sleep was impossible. Every few minutes, I would hear a knock or a thump on the walls, faint but deliberate. The fire kept me warm, but it wasn't enough. The fear was like ice in my veins, and I felt trapped. Morning came again, weak and gray. I ventured outside carefully, inspecting the perimeter. There were more tracks, some deeper, some closer to the cabin walls than the night before. I realized I couldn't stay any longer. The animals, or whatever had been circling me, were too persistent. I packed my things quickly, leaving the food and other supplies behind, and prepared to leave. As I started walking to the car, I noticed something I had missed before. The trees closest to the cabin had deep claw marks, gouged into the bark, some fresh, some older. Whatever had been circling me was huge, stronger than any animal I had ever seen. My pace quickened. The forest felt alive around me, every rustle a threat, every shadow a predator. I reached the car without incident, my heart pounding, my hands still shaking. I drove away slowly, not wanting to panic and crash on the narrow forest road. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following, but there was nothing. By the time I reached the main road and got cell service, I could finally breathe. I reported the cabin location to the local authorities and described the tracks and damage. They told me that large bears sometimes roam the area, occasionally aggressive, and that a ranger would investigate. I never went back. The cabin, once a place of solitude, became a symbol of that night. I still remember the scraping, the circling, the growl that seemed to come from the trees themselves. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a storybook monster. It was real, wild, and terrifying. That experience changed how I looked at the forest, at isolation, and at survival. Every time I hear about someone camping alone, I think of that cabin, and I realize just how quickly things can go from quiet and peaceful to something that tests every instinct you have. Even now, months later, I wake up sometimes at night, feeling the cabin walls around me, hearing faint rustles outside. My mind tries to rationalize it, but the fear is not entirely gone. I learned that the forest does not forgive carelessness, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing is simply being too small, too human, surrounded by the vast, indifferent power of nature. I will never forget the tracks, the claw marks, the feeling of being watched all night, and I will never, ever underestimate how real and how close danger can be in a place that feels safe. I had been planning this solo trip for months, not because I wanted isolation for spiritual reasons or to find myself, but simply because I needed to get away. My life had become a relentless loop of deadlines, commutes, and city noise, and the idea of a week in a remote cabin, surrounded by nothing but forest and silence, felt like the only thing that could reset me. I rented a small cabin deep in a national forest, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through pine and fir trees. The GPS signal would drop halfway, and I'd have to navigate the last few miles with nothing but memory and small, weathered trail markers. The drive there was long, stretching across empty highways that gave way to smaller roads lined with fields and the occasional farmhouse. But the moment I turned onto the forest road, everything changed. The air smelled sharp and clean, a mix of damp earth and pine resin, and the canopy above was dense enough to filter the late afternoon sun into fractured beams of gold and green. My car bounced over ruts and potholes, but the rhythm of the ride was hypnotic, soothing in a way that I hadn't realized I craved. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was low, turning the treetops into a fiery crown, and the cabin itself looked smaller than I'd imagined. A simple wooden structure with a stone chimney and a porch that sagged slightly under its own weight. It had no electricity, just a small solar panel on the roof and a propane heater inside. The isolation was palpable. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and dust. Everything was basic but clean. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a wooden table with a couple of chairs, and a lofted bed in the corner. There was a woodpile stacked outside and a small, old-fashioned lantern sitting on the counter. I unpacked my gear quickly. Sleeping bag, clothes, a first aid kit, food, and started a fire in the stove to chase away the first chill of evening. The wind outside picked up as darkness fell, moving through the trees with a low, almost whispering sound that set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just the wind. It had to be. The first night was uneasy. I had brought a flashlight, but the shadows in the cabin stretched unnaturally long, twisting every corner into something threatening. Every crack of a branch outside made me jump. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. I slept poorly, half on alert, half fascinated by the sounds outside. At one point, I swore I saw movement at the edge of the porch light, but when I checked, nothing was there. I tried to tell myself it was a deer, maybe a fox, nothing more. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Morning brought a deceptive calm. Sunlight poured through the gaps in the wooden walls, and the wind had died down. I prepared a small breakfast, brewed some coffee over the stove, and decided to explore the surroundings. The cabin was surrounded by a thick forest, with a small creek running a few 100 feet away. Birds were chirping, and the forest smelled of wet earth. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't ignore the way shadows moved even in the bright morning light, the way every branch snap sounded closer than it should have. I told myself it was just nerves, that the city's constant hum had dulled my instincts, and now I was hyper-aware. By the second day, I had mapped a small trail around the cabin. I noticed subtle signs: tracks in the mud near the creek, shallow depressions where something had lain, broken branches at odd angles. I told myself it was raccoons, deer, maybe a coyote. The forest was alive with animals, after all. But as I wandered, I started feeling a consistent tension at the edge of my awareness, like the feeling of being watched by someone, or something that didn't want to reveal itself. I checked the tracks repeatedly, tracing their origin, noting that they didn't match anything I had seen in the wildlife guide I brought. The prints were roughly human-sized, though they seemed uneven, like someone had been wearing shoes that were too big or unevenly weighted. I tried to ignore it, but that night, the wind returned with a vengeance. It rattled the cabin, shaking the walls and the roof. Something heavy moved outside. I could hear it distinctly, a thud, then the scrape of something large against wood. My heart raced. I checked the porch. No footprints, nothing. But the feeling of being watched intensified. I kept the stove going longer than necessary, the orange flames flickering across the walls, painting the cabin in a false sense of safety. Every time I dozed, a sound would jolt me awake. Branches breaking, rocks tumbling down the slope behind the cabin, the occasional thump like a boot hitting the ground. By the third day, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I had set up small improvised alarms using tin cans and string around the perimeter of the cabin. Each night, several cans were disturbed. Something had been walking around my cabin, circling it, testing it. I couldn't see it, but the signs were clear. I tried reasoning with myself, hunters, maybe curious locals, but this felt different. The patterns were too calculated, too patient. Whoever or whatever it was knew I was alone. Whoever or whatever it was learning. I stocked my knife at my side and moved the stove closer to the door. I made sure the lantern was filled, ready to light at any sudden movement outside. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every creak, every whispering wind was a threat. By the fourth day, I realized I had underestimated how vulnerable the cabin made me feel. There were no neighbors, no cell signal, no quick escape. If someone wanted to harm me, the odds were stacked against me. Late that afternoon, I went to collect water from the creek. I kept my knife in my hand, scanning constantly. The forest was alive with sound. Birds, insects, and the subtle, irregular thump of footsteps in the distance. I froze when I realized the noise didn't match my pace or direction. Followed me. I ran back to the cabin, heart hammering, the creek bank slipping beneath my boots. When I reached the cabin, I found the tin cans scattered, some broken, the strings severed in one place. Whoever had been circling me wasn't cautious anymore. They were testing my reaction. That night, I barricaded the doors as best I could. I slept lightly, listening to the wind and movement outside, watching for shadows. At some point, I awoke to a scraping sound directly at the front door. Heavy breathing. My stomach dropped. I stayed frozen, knife in hand, listening. The noise stopped, then resumed at the back door. Whoever it was, they were deliberate, moving slowly, testing, waiting for me to act. Dawn came like a relief, though it offered little comfort. I resolved to leave. I had survived 3 nights of being stalked, and that was enough. I packed quickly, scanning the perimeter before leaving. Everything was quiet now, almost too quiet. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, as if aware I was leaving. My car was a small island of civilization, and I climbed in, heart still racing. The drive back was tense. Every sound outside my car seemed amplified, every shadow between trees suspicious. I didn't stop, didn't slow down for the beauty I had noticed on the way in. The highway, the city, the noise, it all felt overwhelming and yet comforting in its familiarity. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't want to. When I returned to my apartment, I unpacked, washed, and tried to sleep. The memory of that cabin lingered like a weight in my chest. But with daylight, with people around, and with the security of locked doors and walls, the tension slowly ebbed. I knew that what had been circling me, whatever it was, had waited patiently, learning. I also knew I had survived because I stayed alert, kept calm, and respected the reality of my vulnerability. Weeks later, I told a friend about the trip. They asked what I had seen. I said nothing, not because I hadn't seen anything, but because naming it made it more real, and the memory was still vivid enough to chill me. I had left the cabin behind, but I had not left the forest entirely in my mind. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, still carries a trace of that terror. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. I don't regret the trip. I needed to face the wilderness, to see the rawness of being truly isolated. But I carry the lesson always. Nature is beautiful, but it is indifferent, patient, and sometimes perilous. Survival doesn't come from luck. It comes from attention, caution, and the stubborn will to move when every instinct wants you to freeze. I had survived, and that was enough. I came home changed, alert in ways I had never been, carrying with me the clear, unromantic truth of isolation, fear, and survival. I drove up the narrow dirt road that led into the woods, the tires crunching against the loose gravel and fallen pine needles. It was late afternoon, the sun low and diffused through the thick forest canopy, casting long, trembling shadows across the path. The air smelled damp and earthy, like the forest had been holding its breath all day. I had been looking forward to a weekend alone in the cabin for weeks, a chance to disconnect from the city, from the constant noise, the screens, and the people. I had planned meticulously: food, water, a first aid kit, a small camping stove, lanterns, flashlights, and extra batteries. I had even downloaded offline maps because the cabin was far enough off the grid that cell service was unreliable at best. The cabin finally came into view, tucked away in a small clearing. It was old, but sturdy, built of thick logs that had darkened over time, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, hinting at decades of heavy snow and rain. The windows were small, and the glass in some panes was streaked with grime, but the place had a charm. The door creaked when I pushed it open, revealing the interior, which smelled like wood smoke and damp moss. Dust motes floated in the slanted rays of light coming through the windows. I set my backpack down, feeling a small thrill of solitude and freedom. I spent the next hour unpacking, arranging my supplies neatly, and checking the stove and lanterns. The cabin had a wood-burning fireplace, and I stacked some logs near it, testing the fire starter. I wanted a fire to burn that night, to chase away the chill and give me a sense of safety. Outside, the forest was quiet. Birds had mostly gone silent, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant crack of a branch snapping under some animal's weight. As night fell, I built the fire in the fireplace. The flames licked the walls with warm light, and the shadows danced in the corners of the room. I ate a simple meal and sat in a chair near the fire, the heat radiating onto my legs. The silence outside was thick, almost tangible, and for the first few hours it felt like a relief. I felt separated from the world, protected in this small wooden fortress. But around midnight, the first unease crept in. I heard something outside, a sound like gravel being shifted slowly across the ground, accompanied by a faint, low thump. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a raccoon knocking over a branch, but the sound persisted. It was deliberate, almost rhythmic, and seemed to circle the cabin. I picked up the flashlight and shone it through the window, scanning the trees, but the beam only cut through the darkness briefly before revealing nothing. I told myself it was nothing, just animals, but my stomach nodded. I felt the hair on my arms rise. I tried to calm myself by focusing on the fire, listening to the crackle and pop of the logs, but the sounds outside grew bolder. Branches snapped closer to the cabin, and the gravel under the tires of my car, or at least what I thought were gravel sounds, shifted again. I realized I hadn't locked the cabin door properly. I went over and turned the old, rusty lock, the metal clanking in a way that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet night. Then I heard it, a heavy, deliberate footstep on the wooden porch. My heart jumped. Whoever or whatever was out there, they weren't small. The porch creaked as the weight shifted. I stayed silent, holding my breath, listening as it moved slowly across the boards. The sound stopped suddenly, and a chilling wind blew through the cracks of the window frames, carrying the smell of wet earth and something else. Something metallic, like rust or old blood. I felt a wave of panic. My flashlight was inside, next to the fire. I didn't want to leave the warmth of it, but I also knew I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed a hatchet I had brought for firewood and held it tightly, its weight cold and grounding in my hand. Slowly, I approached the door, listening. There were no sounds now, only the heavy breathing I could hear in my own ears. I opened the door a crack and shone the flashlight across the porch. Nothing, just the shadows of the trees stretching over the clearing. I forced myself to step outside, scanning in a wide arc, the beam slicing through the darkness. The forest was quiet again, eerily quiet, as if it had paused to watch me. I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and went back to the fire, trying to convince myself it had just been my imagination. But sleep was impossible. Every small noise made me tense. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Around 2 a.m., I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin, thinking it might give me a sense of control. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the cold night. The snow from earlier in the week had melted, leaving the ground damp and muddy. I traced the edges of the clearing carefully, sweeping the beam of light over every tree and shrub. There were tracks in the mud, footprints, too large and heavy to be mine, that circled the cabin. They weren't continuous. The soil was soft in places, but I could see where someone or something had paused, almost like it was watching me. I went back inside, my hands shaking. I decided I needed to barricade the door. I pushed a chair against it and placed a stack of firewood behind it. I moved a small table as well, anything that could slow someone down. Then I sat back by the fire, gripping the hatchet, listening. Hours passed. The footsteps never returned, but the silence was heavy, pressing. Dawn finally came, pale and gray, filtering through the trees. I could see the footprints clearly now. They were human, undeniably so. Large boots, heavy, with deep tread, and they led off into the woods in no clear direction. But I noticed they came from the side of the cabin closest to the road. Whoever had been here had approached from there, and then vanished. I didn't feel safe staying. I had to leave. I packed quickly, keeping the hatchet in one hand and my backpack on my back. I avoided looking out the windows directly, not wanting to see anyone waiting in the shadows. I opened the cabin door cautiously, moving to the car. It was there, exactly where I had left it, tires half sunk in the soft ground from the previous night. I locked the doors behind me and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the dirt road, revealing fresh tire tracks alongside my own. Someone had been here during the night, driving back and forth, maybe watching. I drove slowly, every sense alert. The forest seemed to close in on the road, the trees leaning over like silent sentinels. I didn't dare stop until I reached the main highway, where I could see other cars, other signs of civilization. The feeling of being hunted didn't leave until I reached a small town a few miles away. I parked at a gas station, shaking, and called the local sheriff. They came and took notes, but when they checked the area, they found no one. No footprints that matched mine or the tracks in the mud, only faint impressions that had been partially washed away by rain. Weeks later, I went back with a friend who knew the area. We walked the clearing, examined the footprints, and discovered that someone had been living in the woods nearby. There was a makeshift campsite, hidden in a grove, complete with a fire pit, tarps, and supplies. No one was there at the time, but it was clear they had been close, watching, perhaps even using the cabin when I wasn't around. The thought made my stomach churn, but it also explained everything. The sounds, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. I realized that in these woods, alone and isolated, I had been vulnerable, and someone had taken advantage of that. After that, I installed security cameras and alarms around the cabin. I reinforced the doors and windows, and I never stayed overnight alone again. I kept the hatchet near the bed and made sure my phone was charged and accessible. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me the importance of preparation and vigilance. The forest is beautiful, but it is not empty, and sometimes the most frightening things are not supernatural. They are human, watching silently from the shadows. I had been driving all day to reach the cabin, a small rental tucked deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. The GPS had given up about an hour outside of civilization, leaving me on a winding dirt road that narrowed and twisted around old pines and oaks. The air had grown heavier, damp and thick with the smell of wet soil and decaying leaves, the way forests always smell when the sun barely touches the ground. I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, just the faint scrape of my tires over gravel. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin itself was old, built from rough logs and weathered timber. It had a small porch that sagged slightly under years of neglect and a metal roof that gleamed dimly in the last light of day. I carried my bags inside, setting them on the floor of the small living area, which smelled faintly of mildew and pine. The walls were lined with shelves holding old books, a few dusty mugs, and some jars that had clearly been there for years. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I could hear the wind through gaps in the walls, carrying the distant sound of branches scraping together. I started unpacking, moving my clothes into a small wardrobe and placing my things on a counter in the kitchen area. The cabin had no cell signal and the Wi-Fi was spotty at best, so I knew I was completely cut off. I had brought enough food and supplies for a few days, but the isolation already pressed down on me, a heavy weight in the pit of my stomach. I told myself it was fine, that this was what I had wanted, a place to disconnect, but the silence felt different here. The forest wasn't quiet in a comforting way. It was quiet as if it were holding its breath. As night fell, I lit a few candles and started a fire in the small stone fireplace. The flames crackled, casting shadows across the walls, and I tried to focus on the warmth and light to push the feeling of unease aside. I had planned to spend the evening reading, but my eyes kept wandering to the windows, where the dark trees pressed close, almost like they were leaning in to watch. I told myself it was ridiculous, that trees don't watch people. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees made me jump. Around 3 a.m, I woke to a sound that froze me in place. A low, deliberate thud from outside, near the porch. My heart started racing. I stayed very still, listening. Another thud, this one followed by a scratch against the wooden siding, slow and deliberate. I felt my stomach tighten. It was too controlled to be an animal like a deer or a raccoon. I remembered the hunting rifle I had brought, leaning against the corner by the fireplace. My hands shook as I grabbed it, chambering around. I approached the window cautiously, trying not to make noise. I could barely see anything beyond the dim moonlight, but the shadows between the trees seemed unnaturally still. My mind ran through every possibility, every scenario I had ever imagined. None of them good. I debated whether to step outside to check, but the thought of walking into the darkness alone made me hesitate. Then I heard the sound again, closer this time, right at the edge of the porch. It was the unmistakable scrape of metal against wood. Slow, deliberate. Someone was trying to get in. My heart slammed against my ribs as I crouched behind the counter, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. My breathing felt loud in my own ears. The next sound was a knock on the door, sharp and insistent. I realized I had to act fast. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, moving to the door with as much quiet as I could manage. I shined the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, and I caught a glimpse of a figure slipping between the trees. Someone was out there watching me, waiting. Panic surged. I slammed the door shut, locking it, and ran to the windows to block them with furniture. The forest seemed alive with sound now, branches snapping, leaves rustling, every movement amplified in the darkness. Hours passed like that. I stayed on high alert, watching every shadow, listening for the faintest noise. Sleep was impossible. The wind picked up outside, and I realized the sounds I had first thought were human. Footsteps, scraping, thuds, were probably a mix of branches falling and animals moving in the dark. But the fear had rooted itself deep in my mind, and I couldn't convince myself otherwise. I spent the rest of the night crouched near the fireplace, rifle across my lap, flashlight trained on the doorway, waiting for something that might never come. Morning didn't bring relief, only a dim light filtering through the trees. I stepped outside cautiously, rifle still in hand, and the forest looked normal, almost serene. Sunlight spilled across the leaves, and birds had started singing again. It was disorienting, like the tension from the night hadn't happened at all. I inspected the porch and the perimeter of the cabin. There were no signs of anyone having been there. No footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing. I felt foolish for panicking, but the adrenaline hadn't left me. I spent the day exploring cautiously, staying within sight of the cabin. I collected firewood, checked the water source, and tried to relax. But I couldn't shake the memory of those sounds, the feeling of being watched. Even in daylight, the forest felt oppressive, the trees standing like silent sentinels. I realized that the real danger wasn't a stranger hiding in the trees. It was the isolation, the way being completely alone with your thoughts could warp your mind. The fear had come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a primal, uncontrollable thing. That night, I tried a different approach. I lit a larger fire in the fireplace, using every log I had to create a wall of light and heat. I moved the furniture so I could see every angle of the room, every doorway. I kept the rifle within reach but focused on staying awake and alert rather than imagining threats. I forced myself to eat, to drink water, to move around and do small tasks, anything to maintain a sense of reality. The night passed more quietly, though I still jumped at every small noise. The next day, I decided to hike back to the main road, at least partially, to reconnect with civilization. The hike was long and exhausting, but I felt calmer with every step away from the cabin. When I finally reached the point where my car was parked, I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease for the first time. Driving back to the nearest town, I reflected on the experience. The cabin hadn't been haunted. There were no supernatural forces at play, no fairy tale monsters hiding in the woods. The fear I had felt was entirely real, entirely human. It had come from isolation, from being cut off from other people, from the unknown shadows in the dark, from the sheer unpredictability of the forest. When I returned home, I made a decision. I would never stay in an isolated cabin like that again, not alone. I realized that some parts of the world are better experienced in daylight, in the company of others with safety nets in place. The forest had taught me something valuable. Fear is real, but it is also manageable if you respect it and prepare for it. I didn't tell anyone about the night I spent in the cabin. I didn't need to. The memory stayed with me, vivid and sharp, a reminder that the human mind can create terror from nothing, that isolation can magnify every creak and shadow, and that survival isn't just about defending against external threats. It's about maintaining control of your own fear. Over the following weeks, I revisited the idea of isolation in safer ways. I went camping in groups, always with other people, always during daylight. I hiked, explored, and enjoyed nature without the crushing weight of fear pressing in. But the cabin remained in my mind, a dark corner of memory that I could visit safely now, knowing that I had faced it, survived it, and learned from it. The woods themselves were no longer threatening. They were simply a place, full of life and quiet and shadows. But I had learned to respect the very real power of the human mind to turn silence and darkness into a nightmare. That experience didn't just scare me, it changed me. I became more cautious, more aware, and more prepared for the unexpected. I kept my survival skills sharp, my awareness high, and my instincts honed. The cabin itself was gone from my daily thoughts, replaced with a quiet understanding. Fear is a tool, not an enemy, and reality is always scarier than any story we tell ourselves. And in that knowledge, I found a kind of peace, a way to move forward without being trapped by what I had endured, knowing that I could face the darkness and come out whole. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of being alone in the woods, away from anyone, felt like the perfect escape from the endless noise of the city, from the constant hum of people, cars, and work. The cabin I found was remote, nearly a mile from the nearest road, perched on the edge of a dense forest. It was small and old, wooden, with a steep roof and a single chimney, the kind that seemed inviting at first glance but also had a sense of isolation, the kind that made the mind start filling in its own stories. The forest around it was thick, tall pines and oaks with dense undergrowth, so dense that the sunlight only reached the floor in patches. The drive up was long. Gravel roads, potholes, and the occasional deer crossing kept me alert. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, the forest turning orange and gold with the late afternoon light. I parked the car, unloaded my bag, and looked at the cabin. It was silent, too silent. No birds singing, no wind rustling the trees, just stillness. I shrugged it off as the normal hush of the late afternoon forest and carried my bag inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. Cobwebs hung in corners, and there were scratches on the wooden floor that looked like animals had been inside before. The furniture was simple. A wooden table, a couple of chairs, a small bed in the corner, and a stove. I unpacked slowly, trying to make the space feel like mine for the next few days. I stacked firewood near the stove and checked the windows. They were thick, old glass, and most had locks, though the locks looked fragile. Outside, the forest seemed to press against the cabin, darkening as the sun sank lower. Night came fast. I lit a fire in the stove, the crackling filling the quiet cabin. Shadows danced on the walls, long and twisting with the flicker of flames. I made a simple dinner, canned beans heated in a small pot, and tried to ignore the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The forest was alive, I told myself. Animals, maybe a fox, a raccoon, nothing more. I forced myself to focus on the warmth of the fire and the smell of burning wood. The first sound came late in the night, a thump, soft but deliberate, like something heavy brushing against the cabin. I froze. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was just the wind. The trees were close, branches brushing the cabin, leaves rattling. I tried to calm myself and went back to my small cot, pulling a blanket tightly around me. Then, another sound, a scratching, sharper this time, at the side of the cabin. My pulse jumped. It wasn't the wind. Wind doesn't make deep, deliberate scratches. I didn't sleep much. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every creak of the old wood made me tense. The wind howled outside, carrying sounds that could have been branches breaking or paws moving across dry leaves. I told myself to stay calm. I was in a cabin with solid walls. I was safe. Morning didn't bring comfort. The first thing I noticed was the tracks outside. Large, deep paw prints pressed into the mud around the cabin. Too big for a dog, too precise for a bear walking casually. They circled the cabin, coming close to the walls, stopping at the windows, then heading back into the woods. My stomach turned. This wasn't a random animal passing by. This was deliberate. Something was assessing me, sizing me up. I spent the day making the cabin more secure. I reinforced the windows with sticks I could wedge against the frames, checked the locks, and moved the heavier furniture in front of the door. I kept a knife on the table next to the bed and another in my pocket. Every sound outside made me flinch. A snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the brush of something large against the undergrowth. I didn't leave the cabin, not even to get water from the small stream nearby. The tracks showed me that whatever was out there wasn't afraid of humans. The nights were worse. I could hear breathing sometimes, heavy and low, close to the cabin walls. There were moments when I thought I saw movement through the windows, huge shapes moving just beyond the light of the fire. I never saw eyes, never saw teeth, but the shadows alone made my mind race. I started sleeping with my back against the wall, knife in hand, fire close. Days passed, and I began to notice more signs. The firewood I had stacked outside was shifted. My bag had scratches along the side. I started keeping everything inside the cabin, closing the door every time I left. Even small movements outside made me jump. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. Every plan I had made for emergencies was useless. On the third night, I heard it again, closer than ever. The thump of heavy paws on the porch, followed by a scratching at the door. I held my breath, gripping the knife tightly. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear, wolf, something worse. I had heard of wild mountain lions in these areas, large, silent, deadly. Everything I had read about survival in the woods came to mind, but nothing felt sufficient. The animal stayed for hours. I could hear it pacing outside, sniffing, circling, moving. Occasionally, it would tap the window with its paw, and I could feel the vibrations through the floor. I stayed motionless, barely breathing, waiting for some sign that it had gone. Morning came slowly, gray and heavy, and when I finally dared to look outside, the paw prints were all around the cabin, but there was no sign of the animal itself. I knew then that leaving wasn't optional. I had supplies, yes, but I couldn't survive indefinitely while something this large and determined was outside, studying me. I spent the next day preparing. I packed essentials: food, water, fire-starting tools, and my knife. I planned the fastest route back to the road. The forest, I realized, was both cover and danger. Any sudden movement could draw attention. I decided to wait until late afternoon, when shadows were long but daylight still offered visibility. The walk out was tense beyond measure. I kept my eyes on the tracks, constantly scanning the woods. Every crack of a branch made my heart jump. I thought I saw movement in the trees ahead more than once, but it always turned out to be a trick of light and shadow. I moved slowly, deliberately, trying not to make any sudden noises. At one point, a large black shape darted between the trees, and I froze, barely breathing until it vanished. I wasn't running. I knew that sudden movement might provoke it. It took hours to reach the road. By the time I saw my car, I was exhausted, covered in sweat and mud, shaking. I never looked back. I didn't want to see the shape following me. I loaded the car quickly and started the engine, the sound of it loud and comforting after the quiet of the woods. As I drove away, the cabin faded behind me, swallowed by the trees, and the road opened up into the familiar stretches of asphalt. The relief didn't come immediately. Even after hours of driving, I kept glancing at the woods on either side, expecting to see movement. My body was tense, my nerves raw. It took days before I could sleep without imagining heavy paws on the porch. I never returned to that cabin. I told myself it was enough to have survived, to have gotten out. Some experiences, I realized, weren't about adventure. They were about staying alive. The forest remained quiet after that, but I knew it hadn't been quiet because nothing was there. The paw prints, the sounds, the scratches, they were proof. I had encountered a predator, a real one that didn't care about legends or fairy tales. It was patient, it was curious, and it was deadly. I never saw it up close, and I hoped I never would, but I remembered everything. The weight of its presence, the sound of it moving through the forest, and the long, terrible night when the world outside my cabin was alive with something I could neither reason with nor escape completely. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The cabin was remote, tucked deep in the woods near the edge of a frozen lake. It was the kind of place that promised solitude, the kind where your phone barely worked, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I had been craving quiet, away from the constant noise of the city, and I thought bringing my dog, Max, would make it better. Max was a large German Shepherd mix, mostly calm but alert, with a sharp intelligence in his eyes that always made me feel safe. The drive was long, winding through roads that were barely paved, flanked by thick trees that crowded the sky. The closer we got to the cabin, the heavier the forest became, the shadows deeper, the air colder. Max sat in the back, ears twitching at every sound, his eyes scanning constantly. I watched him in the rearview mirror, noting how his body tensed whenever a crow cawed or a branch snapped. The air had that damp, earthy smell of wet pine needles, the kind that sticks in your nose and clings to your clothes. When we finally arrived, the cabin appeared as if it had grown out of the forest itself. Its wood was weathered and darkened with age, the windows small and covered in grime. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch creaked under my feet as I stepped out. I could see Max's tail wag once, slowly, then stiffen. He had that look on his face that made me pay attention, a mix of curiosity and caution. The interior was cold and musty. Dust covered the floorboards, and spiderwebs hung in corners. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, and Max walked cautiously around, sniffing everything. There were signs of previous occupants, an old rug, a stack of newspapers from a decade ago, but no personal belongings. It was empty, quiet, almost too quiet. I unpacked my bag, set down some food and water for Max, and made a fire in the old stone fireplace. The crackle of the fire was comforting, though it did little to shake the chill that clung to the cabin. Night came fast. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the shadows in the cabin grew long and dark. Max lay near the fire, occasionally glancing toward the door or windows. I tried to read, but the silence pressed down on me. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it sounds I couldn't immediately place. The crack of a branch, a distant animal call. My unease grew slowly, a gnawing sensation that something wasn't right. Around midnight, I first noticed the scratching. It was soft at first, almost like the wind brushing against the side of the cabin. But then it became deliberate, rhythmic, scraping at the wooden walls. I froze, listening. Max had lifted his head, ears forward, eyes wide and staring toward the back of the cabin. My heart started to pound. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. Max growled low in his throat, a deep rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. I stood slowly, trying to peer out into the darkness beyond the windows. Nothing moved in the shadows outside. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by silence, heavy and tense. Max's growl didn't stop. He got up, hair bristling along his spine, and moved toward the door with a cautious, steady step. Then came the growl from outside. Not Max's growl, but something else, deep, guttural, and low. It was distant at first, a warning growl. Then it came closer, moving in deliberate, careful steps. Max's hackles rose, and he barked once, sharp and loud, then froze again, staring into the dark. My mind raced. There shouldn't have been anything nearby. I hadn't seen any cars, any people, any other animals. Just the forest. The sound circled the cabin. I could hear branches snapping under heavy paws, something large moving with a quiet stealth. Max barked again, louder this time, trying to warn me, trying to make me understand. I grabbed a heavy lamp, holding it like a weapon, heart hammering in my chest. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, confined, the walls pressing in. I realized then that we were trapped in a circle of shadows. Suddenly, the back door rattled. Someone or something was trying it. Max lunged, barking fiercely, teeth bared, hair standing on end. The door held, though the handle shook under the force of the knocks. My fear spiked. Whatever it wasn't small. It had to be big, strong, and dangerous. I backed toward the fireplace, the lamp raised. Max stayed at the door, barking and growling, refusing to let it go. I tried to think logically. The nearest road was miles away. No one would randomly be out here at this hour, and yet something was circling us. The scratching returned at the windows, then stopped, then the growl again, closer, now coming from the front porch. I realized it wasn't a human. No human would growl like that. Then I saw it. Through the window, a large shadow moved against the porch light I had left on. A dog, or something like a dog, but wrong, too big, with yellow eyes that glowed in the dim light. Max froze, every instinct screaming, every muscle taut. The creature outside was silent now, watching, calculating. The way it moved was different, predatory, careful. I stayed as still as I could, trying to keep calm. Max barked, warning it, challenging it, but the thing didn't retreat. It paced slowly, circling the cabin like it was marking territory. I thought of the stories about wild dogs, packs of stray wolves, coyotes that adapted to humans. This was one of them, maybe desperate, maybe starving, but still dangerous. Hours passed like this. The creature never left. It would pace, stop, growl, move to another side of the cabin. Max never left my side, never stopped barking, never stopped growling. I realized we were both locked in a standoff with something that didn't understand fear. I had food, but I wasn't willing to risk opening the door. Every sound outside made my stomach turn. At dawn, I finally saw the thing clearly. It was massive, bigger than Max, its coat matted and filthy, one eye clouded as if injured long ago. It wasn't wild but feral, used to living on the edge, scavenging for survival. Hunger and pain radiated off it in waves. Max stayed alert but cautious, not charging anymore, just keeping distance. I could feel the tension like a living thing pressing against me, a mix of fear and exhaustion. I realized what I had to do. I couldn't stay in the cabin all day. I had to move. I packed everything slowly, making as little noise as possible. Max stayed close, ready to react. The creature watched, but it didn't attack. I think it understood instinctively that I wasn't easy prey. Slowly, we edged toward the truck parked a few hundred feet down the dirt path. The creature followed at a distance, always watching. When we finally reached the truck, I started it quietly, careful not to rev the engine too loud. Max jumped in, and I drove slowly, keeping the headlights low until we were far enough. The creature stayed behind, standing in the middle of the road, watching us leave. It didn't chase. It just watched, a shadow among shadows, and then melted back into the forest. The drive back was tense, silent except for Max's occasional growl or bark at distant shapes in the trees. I realized I hadn't felt relief until the city lights appeared, warm and familiar, a sign of safety. Max relaxed gradually, lying down, though his ears stayed alert. When I finally reached my apartment, I let Max out, and he immediately drank water, ate a bit, and then slept deeply. I sat down, exhausted, realizing how close we had come to real danger. The woods were beautiful, but they had teeth, and the cabin, alone in its shadows, had almost trapped us with something I never wanted to meet again. In the weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I researched reports of feral dogs, packs that roamed forests near remote cabins. They were rare, but they existed. The thing I saw wasn't just a story. It had been real, desperate, territorial, and capable of killing. Max had saved me by being vigilant, by standing his ground without making a mistake. I never went back to that cabin. I still think about it sometimes, the way the forest can turn quiet beauty into a cage. Max and I now stick to trails, busy campgrounds, places where other people are around. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can see those glowing yellow eyes, hear the low growl circling the cabin, and remember the long night when the line between life and death was just a wooden door away. Even now, Max seems to remember. He doesn't like silence the way he used to. He checks the windows constantly, ears alert, tail stiff. He's older now, slower, but I can see the memory of that night in his cautious gaze. We survived because we respected what we didn't understand, because instinct kept us alive. And I know, deep down, the forest keeps secrets that are better left alone. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The cabin I rented was deep in the northern woods, miles from any road, electricity, or cell phone signal. I had planned to spend a week alone, just me, the forest, and the silence. I was careful with my preparation: extra food, bear spray, a few knives, a sturdy backpack, and a first aid kit. The drive had been long, bumping along dirt roads until I finally parked at a small clearing. The cabin itself was small and rustic, made of rough-hewn logs, with a steep roof and a chimney that still smelled faintly of wood smoke. It looked abandoned, yet solid, and that isolation was exactly why I chose it. The first day passed quietly, almost lazily. I chopped wood for the stove, checked the perimeter, and set up my small campsite near the cabin's edge. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction. Tall pines interspersed with birch trees, and the late afternoon sun slanted through the leaves in streaks of gold. Birds called in the distance, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. At night, I lit the stove, cooked a simple meal, and lay on the small cot in the cabin, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for sound. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I had packed a map and compass, but mostly I relied on memory and instinct to wander a few miles into the woods. I followed a stream for a while, finding small waterfalls and pools where the water ran clear and cold. It was serene, almost hypnotic, until I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A large set of tracks in the mud, fresh and deep. They were unmistakably bear tracks. I crouched and examined them. The pads were enormous, at least the size of my hand, and the claw marks were sharp and long. My heart rate picked up, but I reminded myself that black bears were common in this region, and they usually avoided humans. I marked the spot mentally and continued my walk, a little more cautiously now, ears straining for sound beyond the rush of the stream. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was low, and shadows stretched long across the clearing. I noticed something odd. My food supply, which I had carefully stowed in a sealed container outside, had been tampered with. Not entirely raided, but disturbed. A few cans of beans were pushed over, and the container lid was scratched. I froze. Bears were smart, persistent, and powerful. The realization settled in slowly, a heavy weight pressing in on me. I secured the food inside the cabin and double-checked all windows and doors. My stomach churned with unease, but I tried to stay calm. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every distant snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard it, a low, guttural growl from outside. My blood ran cold. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The growl came again, this time closer, followed by a heavy thud against the cabin wall. I grabbed the bear spray and crouched near the door. The smell of something musky and wild filled the air, the scent unmistakably of a large bear. I kept my breathing quiet, hoping it was only passing by, but the sound of claws scraping against the wood made it clear that wasn't the case. The hours stretched endlessly. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. The bear paced outside, testing the walls, sniffing the air, circling the cabin. At one point, I saw its massive silhouette through a small gap in the logs. Its dark fur gleamed in the moonlight, and I could make out the curve of its shoulders, the size of its head, the gleam of its eyes reflecting the stove's fading embers inside. I tried to remind myself that it wasn't aggressive yet, just curious or hungry, but every instinct screamed danger. I thought about the bear spray, about the knives, about the small chance I had if it decided to force its way in. I realized how fragile my safety was, how exposed I truly was in this place. By dawn, the bear had finally left, slipping back into the woods with an almost silent grace despite its bulk. I emerged cautiously, surveying the cabin and surrounding area. I spent the morning reinforcing doors and windows with spare boards, stacking rocks against the lower walls, and moving food as far away from the cabin as possible. I built a perimeter of noise traps, empty cans strung on rope, small bells from my backpack, to alert me if the bear came close again. My hands shook as I worked. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified. I realized that surviving here would mean anticipating the bear's movements constantly, never letting my guard down, and respecting the sheer power of the animal I shared this space with. The next day, I tried to keep myself occupied. I chopped more firewood, cleaned the cabin, and even explored a little farther from the cabin than the previous day. But everywhere I went, I found signs of the bear: broken branches, large scat, fur caught on rough bark. It was hunting in the area, or at least wandering close enough to test its dominance. Each time I saw a track or heard a distant snapping of wood, my pulse quickened. I learned to move silently, to listen for the subtle differences in the forest sounds that indicated movement, to think like an intruder might think. One afternoon, I decided to gather water from the stream. I filled my container and started back toward the cabin, following a different route to avoid the tracks I had seen. Then I heard it, a deep, low rumble behind me, the kind that vibrates in your chest and makes your hair stand on end. I froze, looking around. The trees swayed slightly as something massive moved through them. My heart thumped painfully. I slowly turned, and there it was, standing not 10 meters away, large, black, and impossibly solid. Its eyes locked on me. I was rooted to the spot, my survival instincts screaming at me to move, to run, but every horror story I had ever heard about humans outrunning bears in the wild surfaced instantly. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too loudly. I just held the container in one hand and the bear spray in the other, praying it would move on. Didn't. The bear started forward, slow but relentless, sniffing the air, testing the ground. I remembered a technique I had read about: making yourself look larger, not turning your back, and slowly backing away without sudden movements. My legs shook as I took the first step backward. The bear mirrored me, curious but cautious. My heart felt like it would explode, my ears ringing. I inched backward, never breaking eye contact. My pack scraped against a tree, a loud metallic clink that made the bear stop and glance sharply. I froze, barely daring to move. Eventually, I reached the clearing near the cabin. The bear followed, still moving slowly, smelling the air around me. I edged toward the cabin door, fumbling with the lock. The bear paused just outside, sniffing and growling softly. I shoved the door open, slipped inside, and slammed it shut, heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. I locked it again, reinforced it with a spare board, and sat on the floor, shaking, trying to regulate my breathing. The bear stayed outside for a long time, pacing, testing the walls, before finally moving off into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night, listening to every sound, imagining the bear circling outside, waiting for another opportunity. The following days became a tense rhythm. I rationed food carefully, always keeping it secured away from the cabin. I avoided wandering far from the cabin, instead focusing on chores and preparing for the eventuality of another encounter. I learned to recognize the bear's signs: broken branches, paw prints in the mud, the faint musky smell that always preceded its presence. Each time it returned, I stayed calm, using the bear spray only when absolutely necessary and letting the cabin's sturdy construction be my shield. By the end of the week, I had a new respect for the wilderness, for the raw, unyielding power of a bear, and for my own capacity to stay calm under pressure. I left the cabin carefully, making sure no traces of my presence would attract the bear, moving quickly but quietly down the dirt road toward the nearest ranger station. When I finally reached civilization, the contrast was jarring. The noise of cars, people, and machines felt overwhelming after a week of silence and constant vigilance. But I carried with me a profound sense of survival and the memory of the forest, of the bear, and of the moments when every decision mattered, when my life balanced on instinct, patience, and respect for a creature far stronger than myself. had always been drawn to isolation, the quiet of the woods and the sharp, cold air that made me feel alive. That's why I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the mountains. I wasn't running from anything, at least not consciously. I just wanted to escape the noise of people, the constant weight of schedules, obligations, and the endless background hum of the city. The cabin was old, small, and nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest. It had a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom with a loft above. The kind of place where you feel both safe and exposed at the same time, a paradox I liked. The first day was perfect. I arrived mid-morning, lugging a backpack heavy with food, water, and supplies. The forest was alive with the rustling of wind in the trees, the occasional crow, and the hum of insects. I unloaded my things and took the time to explore the cabin. The wood floor creaked under my weight. The walls were covered in darkened pine, and the windows were streaked with dirt, making the sunlight look hazy. I liked the smell of it, old wood, dust, and the faint trace of smoke from the stove. I set up my small cot, stacked firewood near the stove, and made myself a simple lunch. Afterward, I spent hours walking through the surrounding forest, tracing small animal tracks, and taking in the quiet that was so different from the city. That night, I had a fire going in the stove. The orange glow filled the room, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. It was peaceful, but around 2 a.m, I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal brushing against the cabin, but then I noticed something strange. My backpack, which I had left near the corner of the room, seemed to have shifted. I hadn't touched it. I shrugged it off and went back to sleep, thinking I must have imagined it. Over the next day, I started noticing little things. A cupboard door left slightly ajar, my shoes not exactly where I had left them. A small scratch on the floor near the kitchen table that wasn't there before. I tried to rationalize everything. The cabin was old, the floorboards were uneven. Maybe the wind had blown the door. Maybe I had accidentally nudged the shoes while sleeping. But the feeling of unease grew. By the third night, I could feel it pressing in on me. Something wasn't right. I woke up in the middle of that night again, this time with a sound that froze me in place. It wasn't loud, just a subtle scraping, like fingernails or claws against the wood floor. My eyes darted around the room, the fire from the stove casting flickering light across every surface. My heart raced. I told myself it was probably a branch or a raccoon. Still, the sound persisted intermittently through the night, small, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. By the fourth day, I decided to start documenting what was happening. I took a notebook and wrote everything down, the shifted objects, the sounds, the scratches. I tried to remain logical, reminding myself I was alone in the woods. There was no one else. Yet, every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it. A presence, or maybe just the overwhelming sense of being watched. I checked the perimeter of the cabin during the day. There were no tracks, no signs that anyone had been nearby. The forest was empty, pristine, and quiet. But at night, the cabin felt different. Every creak in the floor, every rustle in the walls felt intentional, targeted. The fifth night was the worst. I had finished a small dinner and settled near the stove with a book. Around 10 p.m., I heard the scraping again, this time closer to the bedroom. My stomach tightened. I gripped a heavy cast iron pan I had nearby. The noise stopped. I waited, listening to my own shallow breathing, the crackle of the fire. Then, a loud thump came from the loft above me. I froze, my mind spinning. The loft was empty. I had checked it in the daylight. The air felt colder suddenly. Though the stove was roaring, the cabin should have been warm. Sleep was impossible. Every sound became amplified. The wind, the settling of the old cabin, my own heartbeat. I started noticing more than just noises. Footprints appeared in the dust near the kitchen counter. Small, like a child's, though I knew I was alone. Items that I had carefully arranged were moved. My supplies were disturbed. At first, I convinced myself I was being careless. But the more I observed, the more deliberate it felt. On the sixth day, I ventured farther into the woods, trying to tire myself out, hoping exhaustion would dull my fear. I found a small creek, the water icy cold and clear. I drank from it, soaked my shirt in it, and followed the bank for a while, looking for signs of life. When I returned, the cabin looked exactly as I had left it, except the footprints were gone. That small detail made me uneasy. Whoever or whatever was inside the cabin had cleaned up after itself. I realized then that this was no random intruder or wild animal. By nightfall, I decided to try and stay awake until morning. I set up a small camera in the corner, aimed at the loft and the doorway. I kept a journal, noting every sound. Around midnight, the thumping started again, slow and methodical, moving from the bedroom to the kitchen, then to the living area. My heart raced. I kept the pan in my hand, but I didn't dare move. Whatever it wasn't in a hurry. It was patient, careful, studying me, I realized. The air in the cabin was heavy and sharp, like static. I felt trapped. The turning point came in the early hours of the morning. I had dozed for a moment, sitting near the stove, and woke to a metallic scent in the air. The stove had gone out. I jumped up, pan still in hand, and turned toward the loft. There was movement. A shadow, small and quick, darted across the floorboards. My rational mind screamed about animals, intruders, the wind, but my instincts told me otherwise. This was intentional, calculated. I stayed awake the rest of the night, pacing the cabin, listening. As dawn approached, the noises stopped. The air felt normal again. I was exhausted, but I had a strange sense of clarity. Whatever had been haunting the cabin was not supernatural. It was someone, or maybe a group, who had been using the cabin, hiding, watching, and manipulating. Perhaps homeless or criminals using the isolation to their advantage. I realized my fear had been fueled by the unknown, the assumption that the woods were empty. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my belongings quickly, checking every corner, every inch of the cabin. Outside, the forest was calm and bright in the morning sun. I moved fast, almost running, down the narrow trail that led to the main road. My legs were trembling, my mind still racing, but relief began to wash over me. I reached the road and flagged down a passing car, explaining little, just asking for a ride to town. Later, back in civilization, I went to the authorities. I gave them the location, explaining what I had experienced. They investigated the cabin and surrounding woods and found signs of an old campsite and hidden storage areas beneath the loft floor. The markings, scratches, and subtle manipulations were consistent with someone having lived there secretly. No supernatural explanations, no myths, just reality. A hidden human presence, patient and deliberate, taking advantage of isolation. The experience left me shaken. I no longer romanticized solitude in the wilderness. The quiet I had loved suddenly felt dangerous, vulnerable. I understood then that fear often comes not from ghosts or fairy tales, but from the unknown capabilities of other people and the isolation that strips you of help and safety. The cabin was just a building, the forest just trees, but the calculated presence of someone else, hiding, waiting, watching, made it terrifying. I never returned to the cabin. I still love the forest, the mountains, and the quiet, but I now respect the fact that isolation has limits. People can hide anywhere, and the line between solitude and danger is thinner than we think. I keep a copy of the photos from my small camera, the faint shadows and movements captured, as a reminder, not of ghosts, but of the very real, very human fear that comes from being truly alone with someone else's intentions hidden just out of sight. Years later, I sometimes think about that cabin. The floorboards creak in my memories, the loft shadow darts in my mind's eye, and the metallic scent of fear lingers. I don't regret going, but I know now that reality can be far scarier than any ghost story, because it's unpredictable, patient, and entirely human. I drove down the narrow, winding forest road with the late afternoon sun slanting through the dense pines. The trees were so tall and close together that the light barely touched the ground, leaving long, shifting shadows that seemed alive. The road was mostly dirt and gravel, and my old truck rattled over potholes and loose stones. The cabin I was heading to was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, a place I had found listed on a small, old website about remote cabin rentals. The photos promised isolation, peace, and quiet. I wanted silence, just me and the forest, a few days away from the world. The GPS signal was weak, and I had to rely on a printed map I brought with me. At one point, I had to leave the road entirely and take a narrow dirt path that twisted sharply around fallen trees and large boulders. The smell of pine and damp earth was heavy in the air. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was almost gone, leaving the sky tinged with orange and purple. The cabin itself was small and rustic, made of weathered wood with a sloping roof and a stone chimney. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though no one was there to light a fire. I parked my truck near the edge of the clearing and stepped out, stretching my legs. The forest was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional distant bird call. I unloaded my bag, which had a few essentials: food, water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a small backpack with extra layers. The cabin door creaked as I opened it, the wood swollen from age and moisture. Inside, it smelled of old pine and dampness, with dust motes floating in the fading light. The cabin was empty, sparsely furnished with a small table, 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. I set my bag down and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. It was beautiful and unsettling at the same time, the trees rising like silent sentinels around me. I decided to make a small fire in the fireplace. I had brought some kindling and dry logs from the back of the cabin. As I struck the match and laid it carefully against the wood, the first flame flickered to life. The room grew warmer almost immediately, and the shadows of the fire danced across the walls. I unpacked a few cans of food and water and ate quietly, listening to the forest outside. The wind began to pick up, brushing against the cabin walls and rattling the windows. The sound was calming at first, but as it grew stronger, it began to feel like the forest itself was moving closer, pressing in on the cabin. I went outside briefly to stretch my legs. The sky was now fully dark, and the forest felt immense, endless. I turned on my flashlight and shone it along the path that led away from the cabin. The beam caught nothing but the dark shapes of trees and underbrush. It was easy to imagine hidden eyes watching from the shadows. I went back inside, locking the door and closing the shutters. I tried to shake the feeling of unease. Bears were native to this region, but I had never encountered one this far from civilization. Still, I reminded myself they usually avoid humans. I went to bed early, letting the warmth of the fire lull me into a restless sleep. But around midnight, I woke to a sound that froze my blood. There was a heavy thud outside, followed by another, then the scrape of something large moving across the ground. My heart pounded as I sat up and listened. The sound was coming from the edge of the clearing, near the place I had parked my truck. My mind raced. I reached for my flashlight, trembling as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, and I caught a glimpse of something massive. It was a bear, a huge adult, its fur dark and matted, eyes glinting in the firelight that spilled from the cabin windows. It was moving slowly, deliberately, sniffing the ground near the truck. My stomach dropped. I knew from documentaries and signs in the park that bears could be unpredictable, especially at night. I stayed perfectly still, hoping it would move on. But it didn't. It sniffed around the edge of the cabin, then turned toward the firelight. The sound of its breathing was deep, heavy, and terrifyingly close. I tried to remember everything I had read about encounters with bears. Do not run. Make yourself look big. Back away slowly. I stayed low, pressing myself against the far wall of the cabin, holding the flashlight in one hand and a heavy stick I had grabbed from the firewood pile in the other. The bear circled the cabin slowly, its massive paws crunching leaves and twigs underfoot. I could hear it sniffing the door, then the walls, then the windows. Every instinct in me screamed to get out, but I knew that opening the door would be a death sentence. Hours seemed to pass. The bear stayed nearby, occasionally thudding against the cabin walls or sniffing the air. I could hear its movements outside, the occasional grunt, the scrape of claws on wood. I tried to remain calm, breathing slowly, keeping my mind focused on survival. I remembered the extra cans of food I had in the kitchen. Bears are often attracted to smell, so I took one of the cans, opened it carefully, and rolled it as far as I could from the cabin, hoping to distract it. The bear sniffed, turned toward the noise, and lumbered after it. My heart pounded, but I didn't move. I waited, listening. Eventually, I heard it stop, sniffing the air, and then crunching through the underbrush. The sounds of its departure were slow and deliberate, as if it was marking its territory while moving away. I didn't dare move for a long time, staying pressed against the wall, listening to the forest. Finally, the night returned to silence, broken only by the wind and distant wildlife. The first hints of dawn brought pale light through the trees. I cautiously peered outside. The clearing was empty. The bear had gone. My truck was scratched and dented in a few places, paw prints and claw marks visible in the mud. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, trying not to make noise. Every sound seemed magnified, every rustle in the leaves a possible threat. I loaded the truck and started the engine, keeping my eyes on the edge of the forest. The first rays of sunlight revealed the full extent of the bear's visit: broken branches, trampled underbrush, and deep tracks in the dirt. I drove slowly, keeping to the main dirt road, constantly scanning the treeline. I didn't stop until I reached a place where the forest thinned and I could see the distant town. Once in town, I pulled into a gas station and finally let myself breathe. I told the attendant what had happened. He nodded grimly, warning me that bears had become more aggressive lately because of low food supplies. I reported the sighting to local wildlife authorities, giving them the location and description. They promised to investigate. I spent the next few days in town, too shaken to return to the cabin. The memory of the bear, its size, its presence, and the sound of its heavy breathing outside the cabin door stayed with me. I realized that the forest was not just beautiful and quiet. It was alive, wild, and dangerous, and I had been incredibly lucky to survive without a direct confrontation. Eventually, I returned home. The cabin rental refunded me, and I vowed never to go back. But the experience changed me. I learned to respect the wilderness in a way I hadn't before. The bear had tested me not out of malice, but simply because it was a wild animal protecting its territory and following its instincts. I learned the importance of preparation, caution, and patience in nature. And even though I had escaped unharmed, the image of the bear, so close and so massive, stayed with me for a long time. Every time I think of that night, I feel the same mix of fear and awe. It was a reminder that the wilderness is not a playground. It is a place where life and death can touch in an instant, and only respect and vigilance keep you safe. I had been driving for hours, winding through roads that were more gravel than pavement, following a map that looked more like a suggestion than an actual guide. I was alone, but I needed this solitude. My life back in the city had become suffocating, a constant blur of noise, deadlines, and obligations I couldn't escape. That weekend, the cabin I had rented was supposed to be my retreat, a place to breathe, to think, to be away from everyone and everything. The cabin itself sat deep in the woods, so far off the main roads that my GPS signal dropped halfway there. The final stretch was just a narrow dirt path lined with thick pine trees, the sunlight barely breaking through their dense branches. By the time I reached it, my car was coated in dust, and my arms were stiff from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. From the outside, the cabin looked like a postcard image of solitude. Dark wood, a stone chimney, a small porch with a rickety railing, and the surrounding forest thick and almost impenetrable. But as I stepped closer, I noticed things that weren't immediately obvious in the photos from the listing. The porch boards creaked under my weight, and one of the steps was rotted through. The windows were streaked with dirt and something else: dust, grime, and maybe even spider webs. I ignored it, thinking a little maintenance was part of the rustic charm. Inside, the cabin smelled of must and damp wood. The floorboards sagged slightly under my weight, Dust motes floated in the beams of late afternoon sunlight that managed to pierce the windows. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. Everything was old but functional. I set my bag down and immediately felt a mixture of excitement and unease, like the place was watching me, silent but attentive. I unpacked slowly, taking my time. The quiet was almost overwhelming. Not the kind of comforting silence you find in a park or a library, but the heavy, thick silence of a place that had been alone for years. I tried to settle in, made a small fire in the fireplace, and brewed coffee in a battered metal pot. The sound of the water bubbling over the flame echoed in the cabin, and I felt an odd sense of relief. At least there was some life, even if it was only in the hiss and bubble of boiling water. Night fell fast. The sun disappeared behind the trees, and the cabin became an island in darkness. The forest was alive with sounds, branches snapping under invisible weight, leaves rustling without wind, distant animal calls that made my stomach tighten. I stayed near the fire for hours, reading and writing in my notebook, trying to convince myself that the noises outside were nothing more than wildlife. But every so often, I'd hear something that made my pulse spike, a thump against the wall, a scrape that sounded like someone dragging their feet across the floor above me. I told myself it was all in my head. The cabin had been empty for years. No one had lived here in decades. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my brain, desperate for company, was inventing movement where there was none. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went to bed early, hoping that sleep would erase my unease. The mattress was thin, and the sheets smelled faintly of mildew, but I wrapped myself tightly in a blanket and closed my eyes. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. It was hard to tell in the pitch-black room, but I kept waking up. Every time I opened my eyes, the shadows seemed to shift slightly, as if the room were breathing. There was a low creak somewhere above me, and the floorboards groaned like the cabin itself was settling. At some point, I realized that the noises weren't random. They were deliberate. There was a pattern, almost like someone or something was moving around upstairs. My cabin had only 1 floor, but above the living area, there was a small attic, accessible by a hatch I hadn't noticed before. My stomach twisted. I was sure it was empty. Surely, it was just the old wood shifting in the cold night air. I tried to sleep again. I told myself firmly that I was being ridiculous, that the forest outside was full of life and movement, and that my imagination was turning ordinary sounds into something sinister. But when I finally dozed off, I had the most vivid, gut-twisting dreams I'd ever experienced. I dreamt of the cabin, exactly as it was, but I was not alone. In the dream, I could feel someone standing just behind me, breathing into my neck, invisible, silent. I woke up gasping, the sweat cooling on my back in the frigid night. The next day, I decided to explore more thoroughly. I had brought supplies, and there was enough firewood stacked outside to last a week. I wanted to make the place feel less like a trap and more like a refuge. As I cleaned, I noticed signs of long-term neglect, cobwebs, dirt caked into corners, mouse droppings. But something else caught my eye. The hatch to the attic had scratches along its edges, fresh and jagged. My heart stopped. Fresh scratches meant someone, or something, had been up there recently. I spent the day cleaning and repairing what I could. I fixed the broken porch step, wiped down the kitchen counters, and swept the floor. But even in the daylight, the unease didn't go away. Every time I glanced at the attic hatch, I felt that same tightening in my chest. It was almost as if the cabin itself was daring me to go up there, to see what it had been hiding all these years. By nightfall, the scratching began again. It started as a soft, intermittent noise, like claws dragging lightly across wood. Then it became louder, heavier, deliberate. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. I was trapped in the logic of curiosity. I had to know what was up there. I found a flashlight and pried the hatch open. Dust and the smell of mold hit me immediately. The attic was low, narrow, filled with old furniture and boxes covered in decades of neglect. I shone the light around, examining the floor. That's when I saw it. fresh footprints in the dust. Someone had been walking here recently. The prints led to a corner where a loose floorboard had been partially removed. I lifted it carefully, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside the hollow space, I found what I least expected: a small, makeshift camp. There were remnants of food wrappers, a thin blanket, and a half-empty bottle of water. The place had been occupied, but recently. Someone had been living in the attic without my knowledge, probably watching me, waiting. My hands shook as I tried to comprehend the implications. I had been completely unaware of a person living in my supposedly deserted cabin. I spent the next hours searching the cabin thoroughly. Every closet, every nook, every shadow was examined. The intruder was gone, but the sense of being watched didn't leave. I moved my bed to the center of the room, kept the fire going, and barricaded doors as best I could. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fireplace, flashlight in hand, listening to the forest, listening to the cabin. I was alive with adrenaline, every nerve ending screaming. By morning, I realized something crucial. Leaving was my only option. I packed quickly, stuffed my belongings into the car, and drove back towards civilization, keeping my eyes on the trees and the empty dirt path behind me. Even as I reached the main road, the feeling lingered. I knew that whoever had been in that attic had done this before and would do it again. Weeks later, I reported the cabin to the authorities. They found evidence that someone had been squatting in the cabin for months, possibly years. No one was ever caught, but I learned that abandoned cabins in remote areas were often targets for people who wanted to hide, to disappear. What I had thought would be a peaceful retreat had turned into a very real threat. I never returned to that cabin. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder that isolation could be dangerous, that silence could be loud with danger, and that the most terrifying things weren't supernatural, they were human. The forest was still beautiful, but I no longer saw it as a refuge. It was a place that could hide anyone, and the shadows could be filled with far more than imagination. Even now, when I drive past secluded roads or see abandoned structures, I think of that cabin. I think of the footprints in the dust, the hollow under the floorboard, and the quiet, patient presence of someone who had been living in my retreat without my knowledge. It changed how I saw solitude, how I saw trust, and how I saw the quiet, empty spaces that seemed safe at first glance. Safety, I realized, was something you carried with you, not something you could ever expect to find in a place on a map. The first time I saw the cabin, it looked abandoned. It was tucked deep in the forest, far from any road or path anyone would normally take. The wood was darkened with age, some boards warped, and the roof sagged in a way that made me uneasy. I had been hiking for hours and needed shelter, and though I usually avoided cabins that looked like they belonged in some horror movie, my legs were tired, my pack heavy, and the sun was slipping behind the treeline. It was late autumn, and the cold had already started to bite at my hands and neck. I made the decision quickly, ignoring the voice in my head that told me this was a bad idea. I had brought my dog, Max, a German Shepherd mix, on this trip. He was my companion for everything, but especially for trips like this. He was alert, intelligent, and more attuned to danger than I was. The second we got close to the cabin, Max stopped. His body stiffened, ears forward, tail low but rigid, and he began to growl softly. I could feel his unease ripple through me, a warning I almost dismissed as his usual caution around unfamiliar places. But then the hairs on his neck stood on end. That made me stop. The cabin had no chimney smoke, no sign of life. The windows were dark, and some were cracked. The door looked heavy and old, but I tested it anyway. It opened with a loud creak. The smell inside was stale, a mix of damp wood, mold, and something more sour, like rotten food left in a corner for weeks. I tried not to gag and stepped inside, with Max immediately at my side, nose to the floor, growling under his breath. The cabin was small, a single room with a loft above, a tiny fireplace, and a sagging wooden table. Dust coated everything, thick enough that stepping on it made a faint powder puff in the air. I knew I had to set up quickly before dark. I laid out my sleeping bag near the fireplace, stacked some of the wood I found in a corner, and gave Max some water from my bottle. He drank cautiously, still watching the shadows in the corners of the room. As the sun set, the cabin grew darker, and the noises of the forest became louder. Branches tapped against the walls, wind whistled through cracks, and somewhere outside, a deer or some other animal moved in the underbrush. I tried to focus on keeping calm, telling myself it was just the woods, just nature. Night fell completely. I lit a small fire, the kind that barely warmed the room but gave enough light to see by. Max curled near my side, ears twitching, eyes reflecting the flames. I tried to rest, but every sound made me tense. The wind outside shifted, and with it came a faint scratching at the walls, like nails on wood. I told myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon or a squirrel looking for food. Max stood immediately, hackles raised, growling deep in his chest. His low, rumbling sound vibrated through the floorboards. I held him close, whispering reassurances, though I didn't really believe them myself. The scratching continued, rhythmic now, deliberate. Then it stopped. I waited, frozen, listening. I told myself if it was just a raccoon, it would leave. But something in the air told me otherwise. Max began pacing, sniffing the floor and walls. Then, from somewhere outside the cabin, a bark rang out. Not a friendly bark, but sharp, aggressive, filled with warning. My heart jumped. Max's ears pinned back for a moment, then forward, his body taut. The barking didn't stop. It was coming closer. I looked out the window. Darkness, thick and impenetrable, but the sounds of movement were clear now. Something large was moving through the trees. Another bark, louder and closer. Max growled, low and threatening, and I could see the way his body tensed as if ready to fight. I grabbed my small camping knife, though I knew it wouldn't do much against a large animal. I whispered to Max, trying to calm him, though I knew it was impossible. Then I heard it, a growl, low and guttural, coming from just outside the cabin. Not a normal dog growl, but something harsher, heavier, with a weight to it. Max stiffened, hackles raised, ears forward, teeth bared. I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't just one dog. There were multiple, and they were circling the cabin. I could hear movement all around. Snapping branches, rustling leaves, low growls, barks. I backed away from the door, pressing myself against the far wall, Max at my side, growling and snarling. The sounds outside became more frantic, more aggressive. Then suddenly silence, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. I could hear my own breathing, my heartbeat, Max's paws shifting on the floor. Then a loud, repeated thump against the door. Heavy, deliberate. Something was trying to break in. Max lunged, barking and scratching at the door. I grabbed a chair and shoved it against the frame, though I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Another thump, louder, closer. I realized then how vulnerable we were. There was no one around for miles. If whatever was out there got in, we would be trapped. The thumping stopped. Silence again. I held my breath, listening. Max stayed close, growling, sniffing the air. Then, faintly, I heard movement on the roof. Scratches, heavy steps, pacing. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. My mind ran through every scenario, none of them good. The sound continued for what felt like hours, though I know it was only minutes. Finally, after what seemed like eternity, the noises outside receded. The barking, the growls, the thumps, they moved away. I didn't dare look out the window until I was sure it was safe. Max stayed tense, ears twitching, eyes scanning the shadows. When I finally peered out, I saw nothing. Only the dark forest, the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. Morning came slowly. The night had been restless. Max had not left my side, and neither had I left the fire. I gathered my things quickly, preparing to leave the cabin and find the main trail. I peered outside, looking for tracks. That's when I saw them. Large paw prints, circling the cabin multiple times. The prints were fresh, the soil still soft, pressed deep into the ground. Whoever or whatever had been outside last night was enormous, and they had circled the cabin like a predator marking its territory. I didn't waste another second. I packed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and grabbed Max's leash. He didn't need it, he was already at my side, alert, scanning the trees. We moved quietly, avoiding the main path as much as possible, taking detours through the underbrush. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made us both freeze, hearts pounding. I knew whatever had been out there was still in the area. By mid-morning, I reached a small creek. I drank from it, rinsed my face, trying to shake off the tension, but Max remained alert, ears constantly moving, body stiff. I could see the way he scanned the trees, always moving, always aware. We continued for hours, navigating the forest as quietly as possible. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made me jump, but gradually we put distance between ourselves and the cabin. Eventually, we found a dirt road, the first real sign of human presence in nearly 24 hours. Relief washed over me. I kept moving, following the road, until I saw a small ranger station. Exhausted, I stumbled in, Max at my side. The ranger took one look at my clothes, my bloodshot eyes, and Max, tense but calm now, and understood. I told him where the cabin was. He nodded grimly and said it was known for aggressive packs of wild dogs or coyotes in the area. Most people don't survive the night if they run into them, he said. I never went back to that cabin. I still dream about the sounds of that night, the circling, the growls, the thumps. Max never left my side again on any hike, always alert, always aware. That night taught me that even in the wilderness, far from people, the rules are clear. You are never alone, and the forest always has its hunters. Weeks later, I looked at the paw prints again in my mind. Massive, deliberate, almost intelligent in the way they circled the cabin. I couldn't forget them. I researched and found accounts of feral dog packs that had attacked cabins and hikers in remote areas, often hunting in groups to intimidate and trap prey. I realized then that what I had faced was not a random animal, not a raccoon or a bear, but something organized, a predator that knew how to isolate and terrify. Since that trip, I've learned to respect the forest differently. I never hike alone. I always carry extra safety gear, and I always bring Max, not just as a companion, but as my first line of defense. That cabin still exists somewhere, deep in the trees, silent and waiting, but I will never approach it again. I survived because of my vigilance, my preparation, and Max's instincts. The night might have been terrifying, I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months. The idea of being completely isolated, surrounded by nothing but the forest, was the kind of quiet I craved. Life had been loud, messy, and exhausting, and the idea of escaping into the woods for a week felt like a necessity, not a luxury. I packed everything I thought I'd need: food, water, a sturdy tent in case of emergencies, a first aid kit, extra batteries, a couple of knives, and a heavy-duty flashlight. I even brought bear spray, though I hoped I wouldn't need it. The cabin I rented was old but well-maintained. A small log structure nestled deep in the mountains, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. There was no cell reception, no neighbors, no roads nearby, just a narrow dirt track leading down the hill to the nearest town. Maybe 20 minutes away if the car was in good shape. The drive up was long, winding through steep hills and thick trees. I remember the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shadows that danced on the narrow road. By the time I reached the cabin, late in the afternoon, the forest had taken on that golden, quiet glow that makes you feel like the world has stopped. I parked my car in front of the cabin, got out, and stretched, breathing the crisp mountain air. There was a faint smell of pine and earth, fresh and slightly damp from an early morning rain. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Rustic, with a stone chimney, a small porch, and a few broken steps leading up to the door. I unloaded my supplies and brought them inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. The floor creaked when I stepped on it, and the windows were thick with dust, making the sunlight look hazy when it entered. There was a small kitchen area with a sink, a stove, and a tiny fridge, a living space with a battered sofa and a table, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a blanket that looked thin but serviceable. The bathroom was small, just a toilet and a shower, but functional. I unpacked, set up my things, and made a simple dinner, enjoying the solitude. As night fell, the forest around the cabin became alive with sounds I wasn't used to. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs under unseen feet, and the distant call of birds settling for the night created a symphony that was both calming and eerie. I lit a small lamp in the cabin and sat on the porch, sipping hot tea, watching shadows shift in the trees. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods, but there was a tension there, a subtle awareness that I was not the dominant creature in this environment. Everything else belonged to the forest. The first night passed quietly. I slept deeply, lulled by the unfamiliar but comforting sounds of the wilderness. I woke in the morning to a mist hanging low in the trees, the sunlight barely breaking through. I spent the day hiking along a trail near the cabin, exploring, noting small animal tracks, the occasional rustle in the underbrush, and the distant sound of running water. I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years, walking among the trees, the sun warming my back, the smell of pine heavy in the air. But that night, something changed. I was cooking dinner when I heard a loud crash outside, like a fallen log or a branch breaking under immense weight. I froze, knife in hand, straining to hear over the sizzling of my pan. Then came another crash, closer this time, accompanied by a low grunt. My heart rate spiked. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a raccoon, something harmless. But then I remembered the bear spray in my cabinet, the extra knife on the table, and I realized the sound didn't match a deer or a raccoon. It was heavy, deliberate, and terrifyingly close. I went to the window and peered through the grimy glass. The porch was empty, but the forest edge was alive with movement. Branches snapped under enormous weight, and I caught a glimpse of dark brown fur disappearing behind the trees. My stomach sank. I knew the warnings about bears in this area weren't exaggeration. They were real, and right now, one of them was near my cabin. I spent the next hour pacing, flashlight in hand, listening. Every sound made me flinch. The wind shifted, leaves rustled, and my imagination ran wild. I tried to calm myself, reasoning that if I stayed inside and didn't make noise, it would leave. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and kept the lights dim. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every snap of a twig, every distant grunt, made me tense. I kept imagining the bear stepping onto the porch, clawing at the door. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously. The yard was littered with signs of a large animal. The ground was disturbed, dirt and leaves scattered in a wide path leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin. Tree branches were broken at waist height, as if something massive had brushed against them. My heart pounded as I realized the bear had come very close, probably last night, testing the perimeter. I decided to be cautious, keeping my food inside and hanging the trash high in a tree before it could attract the animal. The next few days were tense. I kept to the cabin mostly, venturing out only during daylight, staying alert to every sound. I hung my food and supplies in bear-proof containers, made noise when walking outside to avoid surprising a bear, and kept my flashlight and knife at hand. Still, I knew it was out there. I saw large paw prints near the cabin every morning, sometimes fresh, sometimes older. The bear was observing me, moving through its territory, testing my presence. Then, on the fourth night, the situation escalated. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from hiking and constant vigilance. Around midnight, I was awoken by the sound of scratching at the cabin door. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. I froze. My heart hammered. The bear was at the door. I stayed still, listening as it scratched again, sniffed, and then rumbled. A low, terrifying sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The cabin shook slightly under its massive weight as it pushed against the walls. My mind raced. I knew bears were strong enough to break down a door, and this one was big. I grabbed the bear spray and my flashlight, shining the beam toward the door. The porch was empty. Then came a massive thud against the wall, like the bear had slammed its entire body against the cabin. The smell hit me first: wet fur, musk, and something raw. My stomach twisted. I realized the bear was trying to get inside, probably drawn by the smell of food or the curiosity of a human presence. I stayed as quiet as possible, moving slowly toward the back of the cabin where there was a small, reinforced window. I knew I had to make a plan. I couldn't confront it directly. I wasn't strong enough, and it wasn't acting defensively. It was testing, probing, and it could easily kill me if it succeeded. I remembered advice I had read about bear encounters. Stay calm, don't run, and make yourself as big and threatening as possible if it attacks. But I also knew that, in a confined space, that advice only worked if you had no other options. I crept into the kitchen, keeping low, flashlight shaking in my hand. I opened the back door just a crack, careful not to make sudden movements. The bear was on the porch now, massive and dark, sniffing around, leaning against the door frame. I could see its wet nose, its eyes glinting in the faint light, and the muscles rippling under its thick fur. My chest tightened. If it pushed through, there would be nothing I could do. Then I remembered the trash I had hung in the tree. I quietly retrieved some scraps and, using a long stick, tossed them toward the edge of the forest. The bear's head snapped up, ears twitching. It sniffed the air, then turned away from the cabin and padded silently toward the food. I exhaled slowly, heart still racing, and watched as it disappeared into the darkness. The immediate threat had passed, but the fear lingered. The next morning, I took extra precautions. I reinforced the cabin door with the spare boards I found in the shed, double-checked my food storage, and made sure the perimeter was clear. I realized that living alone in the forest wasn't about enjoying solitude. It was about constant vigilance. Bears, like all wild predators, are patient, curious, and strong. One careless mistake, one dropped piece of food, and the situation could turn deadly in seconds. By the 5th day, I had adjusted to the tension, moving deliberately, respecting the presence of the bear without trying to dominate or confront it. I even started to appreciate the rhythm of survival, the quiet awareness, the constant observation, the respect for the natural order. I hiked carefully, always making noise, always watching the underbrush. Every paw print, every broken branch, reminded me that I was a guest in someone else's world. The final night was eerily quiet. No scratches, no grunts, no heavy steps outside. I stayed up late, listening, flashlight in hand, prepared for any movement. But the bear seemed to have moved on, leaving its territory for another stretch of forest. I slept that night more soundly than I had in days, still aware but relieved. When I packed up the cabin on the 7th day, I walked around the perimeter one last time. The first night in the cabin, I could hear nothing but the quiet rustle of the forest beyond the small, frosted windows. The place was remote, so remote, in fact, that even the hum of distant traffic or the faint bark of a dog was absent. It felt like I had driven into another world, one governed only by the cold bite of the wind, the rough smell of pine, and the subtle earthy rot of fallen leaves and wet soil. The cabin itself was modest, a single story with logs darkened by years of rain and sun. Its interior smelled of damp wood and a faint lingering scent of smoke from years past. I'd come here alone to disconnect from everything, to escape the endless noise of life and responsibility, and to be immersed in the raw quiet of the wilderness. The first few hours had been soothing. I unpacked slowly, taking note of every detail: the way the sunlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, the slight draft near the corner window, the faint creak of the floorboards as I moved about. Outside, the wind swirled, shaking the tops of the tall pines and making the cabin shiver in response. I felt a primal peace that only comes from being utterly alone in a place that belongs to the natural world. By late afternoon, I had gathered firewood from a pile stacked neatly near the cabin, carrying it inside in small bundles. The wood was rough, some pieces splintered at the ends, others damp and heavy with moisture. I arranged them carefully in the fireplace, appreciating the simple, deliberate rhythm of preparation. There was a sense of satisfaction in the small, physical task, a grounding in the ordinary and tangible. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long across the cabin floor. I could see the fading orange light through the thin curtains, and the forest beyond was taking on the deep green and black of evening. I lit the fire, the sudden crackle and warmth filling the space around me. The dancing flames threw shadows across the walls, making the cabin seem alive in a quiet, ancient way. I sat near the hearth, feeling the heat against my skin, sipping a thermos of coffee I'd brought along, listening to the slow cadence of the night settling in. It was late, well past the hour I usually felt sleep creeping over me, but sleep did not come easily. There was a strange tension in the air, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I first noticed it when a sound broke the rhythm of the wind, a distant, low howl. It was far enough away that I could not pinpoint its origin, but close enough that it raised the hair on the back of my neck. The sound echoed across the valleys and ridges, a lonely, mournful cry that seemed both natural and unnatural at the same time. I froze, listening carefully, every nerve alert. It came again, this time slightly closer, a bit more deliberate, as if it were testing the air, feeling its surroundings. I reminded myself that this was the wilderness, that wolves and coyotes roamed these forests freely, and that the howl was not unusual. But hearing it while alone in a cabin, surrounded by darkness, brought an unease I could not shake. The shadows outside seemed to deepen, and I felt the weight of isolation press down on me. The night stretched on, and the howls grew more frequent. At first, it was irregular, a single cry, then silence, but gradually, I began to detect a pattern. Something was moving through the forest, circling the cabin, sniffing the air. I felt it instinctively, a tension in the hair on my arms, the tightening of muscles I didn't know were holding. I checked the windows, pulling the curtains aside, peering into the darkness. Nothing visible, just the thick, black outline of trees swaying. A moonless sky that left everything muted and indistinct. Hours passed, the fire dying slowly to embers, and the sounds outside intensifying. Footsteps, or something akin to footsteps, seemed to brush against the undergrowth. Twigs snapped sharply, breaking the rhythm of the wind. Every so often, a low growl or a muted snarl punctuated the silence. My heart began to race. I realized I had underestimated the proximity of the predator, or predators, prowling just beyond the walls of the cabin. I kept reminding myself, wolves are generally cautious around humans. They avoid confrontation if possible. Yet the persistence of these sounds suggested something different. Curiosity, hunger, or both. My mind tried to rationalize each sound. A deer stepping over branches, the wind tossing rocks down a slope. But the instinctual gnawing in the pit of my stomach would not be dismissed. Wolves have a precision about their movements, a stealth honed by generations, and I knew the sounds were not random. They were deliberate. By midnight, I had barricaded the cabin door as best I could, stacking chairs and heavy logs to reinforce it. I moved quietly, listening, every nerve tuned to the forest. The howls were now continuous, a chorus that rose and fell in rhythm, almost conversational, and the snapping of branches was closer than ever. I crouched near the fireplace, firelight illuminating only a small circle of the room, and waited. The air was thick with tension and the faint smell of damp earth, a smell that seemed to seep into the cabin, carried on the cold night air through cracks in the door and windows. Then, without warning, there was a sudden, sharp sound. A thud against the side of the cabin, heavy and deliberate. My pulse spiked. Another thud, this one closer to the window. I realized the wolf or wolves were testing the structure, assessing the resistance. My mind raced. There was no way to fight, no weapon, only a fire poker and my own hands. Panic clawed at my chest. The creatures outside were large, powerful, and patient. Their strength was unmatched, and the quiet intelligence in their movements suggested a predator capable of prolonged observation and calculation. Hours blurred. Sleep became impossible. I stayed near the fire, adding wood in small, quiet increments, Every snap of the logs a small reassurance that I still had some control, however limited. Outside, the night dragged on, punctuated by the steady presence of the wolves circling, testing, watching. I could hear their breathing in the darkness, low and steady, like a drumbeat echoing through the forest. Every so often, a long, low howl would break the pattern, sending a chill down my spine. By early morning, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The wind had shifted, and with it, the sounds outside changed. The circling steps became more sporadic, the howls less frequent. I realized the wolves were retreating, not fully leaving, but withdrawing to the deeper forest. My muscles ached, my nerves were raw, but relief washed over me. I survived the night. I had stayed alert, kept the fire going, and maintained a safe perimeter. The next day, I ventured cautiously outside. The forest floor was marked with tracks, large paw prints pressed into the soft mud, leading around the cabin in looping circles. The prints were enormous, the claws visible, digging into the soil. My stomach tightened as I traced the patterns with my eyes. These were not ordinary wolves. They were big, powerful, and confident. There were signs of hunting, the remains of small animals caught in the underbrush, partially hidden but unmistakably taken by predators. I realized how close I had come to danger and how lucky I was to survive unharmed. Over the next few days, I adjusted my routines. I kept the fire going at all times, gathered extra wood, and remained vigilant. I observed the wolves from a distance, noticing their movements and rhythms. They were smart, patient, and opportunistic, hunting only when necessary and avoiding confrontation when possible. The forest was alive with their presence, a constant reminder that I was a guest in their domain, and any misstep could be fatal. By the time I packed to leave, I had a profound respect for the creatures. I understood, more than ever, the reality of wilderness survival, the razor-thin line between observation and intrusion, between life and death. I had experienced raw fear, calculated risk, and the slow, patient terror of being watched by a predator who understood me far better than I understood them. The cabin, once a refuge, had become a test of my awareness, my patience, and my respect for the natural order. As I drove away, leaving the forest behind, the sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating the cabin in warm light. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but the quiet forest. Yet I knew the wolves were still there, hidden in the shadows, circling and watching, their world unchanged. I felt a mix of relief and awe, a deep understanding that I had survived not because I was clever or strong, but because I had respected the rules of the forest and the intelligence of the wolves. That experience stayed with me long after I returned to civilization. I replayed every sound, every snap of a branch, every low, haunting howl in my mind. I could recall the texture of the cabin walls, the warmth of the fire, and the terror of realizing I